Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our first conversation in Black. My name is Nicole Roebuck, and I'll be your moderator today for this panel. So I thank you so much for joining us, all of you in the audience, and to our panelists who we will soon introduce. I want to remind everyone that today is National HIV Testing Day. This year's theme is My Test, My Way. So know your HIV status and get tested. You can do it at home. There are home test kits now. You can come into a center like in Atlanta. You can get tested on a mobile testing unit like AHF has, but get tested. For more information on where you can get tested locally in Georgia, contact the Georgia HIV/AIDS info lines at 800-221-2728. And you can also visit hivcare.org for sites nationally to get tested. So there are no excuses. I want to let everyone know that for your engagement, we're actually going to be doing some raffle prizes throughout the session. So we want you to stay engaged, pay attention, and hopefully have a good time as well as learn something that maybe you didn't know today. So we're going to start off with a fun question. And we want you who were born under the astrological sign of Cancer to put your name in the chat and your birth date. So how this is going to work is we'll take the first 7 responders, and then they're going to get entered into our raffle that we're going to do at the end. So while that is being done, while y'all are putting that information in the Facebook Live, I want to talk a little bit about what BLACC is. So BLACC stands for Black Leadership AIDS Crisis Coalition. It's an affinity group of AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The group was developed to create a coalition of Black American cultural influencers and health advocates that through the use of innovative, culturally relevant messaging and initiatives are revolutionizing outreach to the Black American community and elevating the education awareness of sexual health and wellness and bringing greater awareness to social justice issues disproportionately impacting the health and wellness of Black Americans. So how the conversations in BLACC came about, we actually have a local BLACC chapter here in Atlanta, and we were talking about what things could we be doing to reach the Black community in Atlanta. And so we talked about wanting to have, there's a need for like having real conversations in the Black community about issues regarding HIV and AIDS and other health disparities in our communities, and hopefully have some real tangible solutions that everyone can get behind and support in their own ways. So we hope that by you joining today, that already says that you're interested and you're interested in getting involved with this issue. I wanted to give you some quick HIV facts and stats. There are about 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States. Too many people. 1 in 7 in the US have HIV, but are not aware of their actual HIV status. In 2019, the highest rate of HIV infections was for Blacks and African American persons at 42.1%. Followed by Hispanic or Latino persons, 21%, and persons of multiple races, 18.4%. Men who have sex with men or gay men accounted for 69% of new HIV diagnoses in the United States. Georgia is the state with the highest rate of HIV diagnoses. DC, which is not a state, actually has the highest incidence. However, that then makes Georgia the state with the highest rate. Also, unfortunately, there is no cure and no vaccine for HIV and AIDS. So our session today will involve questions that we'll pose to our esteemed panelists. And you're going to have the opportunity to also engage from Facebook. So we hope you stay alert and stay attentive. And we're checking to see if you're doing that by doing our second raffle. So we want you, if you're on Facebook Live, Name another HIV awareness day that you're aware of. You must include the date in order to be entered. So again, we're taking the top 7 responders who have it correct. Please go ahead and enter that into the Facebook chat. So while we're allowing our audience to participate in that question, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists today. We have Dr. Pastor Monty Norwood. He's a writer, public theologian, and community activist who serves as assistant professor of theology and coordinator of undergraduate theology at Beulah Heights University. He also serves as a pastor of Bible Way Ministries International and co-founder of the Atlanta Black Faith Leaders HIV/AIDS Coalition. Dr. Norwood and his congregation partner with a variety of groups and partners in a community grassroots-based approach to ministry, including a food pantry, which feeds more than 400 families each month, and through a partnership with AIDS Atlanta and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, provide testing, information, support, and linkage to care at those events. He's passionate about action and results, and on behalf of marginalized, unrecognized, and underserved individuals, families, and communities. He's married to Wanda Jackson Norwood and the father to 3 adult children who are also active in ministry. Welcome, Pastor Norwood.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We also have Dr. David Mailbranch, who is a board-certified internal medicine physician with expertise in sexual health and HIV, STI prevention, and treatment. He's also a public health official, activist, and educator who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He works part-time seeing patients at the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, also known as AHF, at the medical clinic at AIDS Atlanta. Dr. Mailbranch has appeared on the YouTube series Revolutionary Health as part of the Counter Narrative Project, as well as the hashtag Ask the HIV Doc video series and COVID-19 vaccine educational series, The Conversation, both sponsored by Kaiser Family Foundation. Dr. Mailbranch's writings and research have been published in JAMA, the Annals of Internal Medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, and Lancet. In 2015, he penned a memoir entitled Standing on His Shoulders about his relationship with his father, which is available on Amazon. Thank you so much. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we're going to just start off with our questions that we have. Please, let's make this a real conversation and be as transparent as you can. So first, I'm going to start with Dr. Mailbranch. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you agreed to be a guest for this particular panel and topic.
I'll start with why I agreed to do it is because you asked me. So when Nicole Roebuck asks you to do something, you do it, even if it's on a Sunday afternoon. So
Ashe.
That was the main reason there. But I'm originally from upstate New York, born in Schenectady, have lived in Atlanta for the better part of the past 20 years. Am a same gender loving man. So since I was in my teenage years, HIV has always been a part of the landscape. And so it's always been something that's been passionate in my heart from a medical perspective. Training at Grady Hospital as a student at Emory University's medical school back in the mid-90s, saw a lot of people living with HIV that were being treated horribly by a lot of the medical personnel. And I knew I was interested in either pediatrics, psychiatry, or internal medicine. So when I decided to do internal medicine, when it clicked for me, I thought the best specialty I could do was go into HIV, because I'm one of those people that if you see something that people are doing faulty or traumatic, especially to Black people that were living with HIV, I thought to myself, I could do this better than they can. Rather than complaining about it, I would just insert myself into the equation. So that's what I've been doing. So my career has been focused on research, clinical treatment, and prevention of HIV and other STIs, empowering our communities with regards to sexual health, as well as getting people empowered when they go into medical spaces that have been traditionally racist and discriminatory towards us and the diversity within our communities. And then also educating medical providers about how we can be better in treating Black people in diverse sexual and gender identity populations within Black communities in particular. So that's been the focus and the passion that I've had for the past 20 years.
Thank you so much. We're so glad you're in our community. How about you, Pastor Norwood? Tell me about yourself, what you do, and why you agreed to be a guest for this particular topic.
Sure. So I am a native of Atlanta, born and raised here. And I tell people when they ask me what I do for a living that I teach and I preach. So I'm a professor of systematic theology at Beulah Heights University. And as you said in the introduction, I pastor Bible Way Ministries International, which is the church that I grew up in. I came back to Atlanta about 15 years ago to succeed my father as the pastor of that church. So I had the privilege of pastoring the church that I grew up in. And my journey with HIV and AIDS started in the mid 80s while a student in seminary, Fuller Theological Seminary in Southern California, and serving as an associate pastor at Ward African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I got a call one night from UCLA Medical Center that a gentleman who was not even a member of the church, but who attended regularly, listed us as his church of record. And because I was the minister of visitation, they called me because he was dying of AIDS and his family had disowned him, would not come to the hospital. And that began a journey of loving people that families and many in the public who misunderstood HIV and AIDS, or because of the stigma attached to it, had detached themselves. And my journey has just taken me on a course that's allowed me to know families and individuals, love them, stay connected to them. And I've appreciated that journey.
Well, we appreciate you. You're such a huge ally for us in this community. So I'm going to stick with you, Pastor Norwood.
Okay.
Tell us about your perspective when it comes to HIV and faith. Do you think that faith plays a role in the well-being and health of those living with HIV?
Absolutely, by all means. No matter, the religious perspective of faith, the modality of practice may be different, but I think because many would agree that we're spiritual beings, that definitely I think our faith plays a part in it. And so as a practitioner, one who actually teaches and trains pastors, one of the controversial things that happens is that we talk about the LGBTQ community. And when I inform pastors that I'm teaching that whether you realize it or not, you have LGBTQ persons in your circle of friends, in your congregation, in your family, here in our student body, I often get very volatile pushback. As if people say to me, you don't know me like that. And I just try to get people to understand that this is something that is a part of our society and a part of our lives at every level. And for pastors, if pastors are willing to become safe spaces to provide places of solace for persons to come and to share and to get support and to get nurture, that goes much further than taking a negative view of this or a view that denies the reality and existence of those in the LGBTQ community who, again, are in our families, in our congregations, in our circle of friends, and as a professor, even in our student body. So for me, it's a cause to advocate for because my faith tells me something called the Great Commandment, that Jesus taught that the greatest commandment is not only to love God, but to love people, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so if that is true, and I believe that it is, we don't get to distinguish or discriminate in terms of who our neighbor is and how we love them and support them. And so all the more my faith urges me, my faith compels me to show that kind of unconditional love that Jesus talked about.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to toggle it over to you, Dr. Mailbranch. What do you think about HIV and faith? Do you think it plays a role in the well-being and health of those living with HIV, especially as a scientist, as a practitioner? What do you see?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, as far as my positionality in this from a faith and a religious standpoint, I was raised Catholic in upstate New York. But typically I would denote myself as spiritual, having faith, but not ascribed to one certain denomination or church. So that's the position that I'm coming from. As a scientist and a researcher, I can tell you that even when I've conducted research studies with Black gay men about issues of race, sexual orientation, support systems, faith always comes up as a part of the equation. And I remember one gentleman, we were doing interviews years ago, probably 15 years ago or so. And he said he remembers when he was growing up, there were two places or two occasions when his mother really forced him to get clean. And I was like, I knew what they were, but I kind of asked him, you have to ask in these qualitative research questions, well, what were they? He said, well, when I went to church and when I went to see the doctor. And so when you see those kind of things and when you hear that feedback from people, you understand kind of the importance that faith plays a role in people's lives. And I've seen it both within our Black, same gender loving and gay LGBTQ plus communities, but also on an individual level as a clinician, where I've seen patients come in, talk about their faith, how that helped them through a hard time. And it's not always the narrative that you hear in the media, where it's, Black communities are so homophobic, or it's as if there's one big monolithic Black church that is homophobic, as if we have a monopoly on sexual prejudice that white people, Latin folks, Asian folks, other groups do not. White people are not discriminatory against diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. That's not the case at all. And I've had patients that have come in. I had one young man come in to see me years ago who brought in both his parents, who were both pastors, and they were very supportive of him. They were supportive of him when he invited them into his reality that he was the same gender loving man. And they were also very supportive of him when it came to his HIV status and making sure he followed up with his appointments and took his medications and stuff. And the thing is that we don't hear those stories enough because America tends to be so anti-Black. They always want to focus on the negative and pejorative aspects of our communities instead of telling these narratives where things are very affirming. And yes, there are pastors that may preach certain homophobic rhetoric and do that, but they're also very much affirming pastors and churches and congregations. And so we need to understand that there's a bit of both of those, and it's up to people. They kind of navigate how they want to stay in this, but the importance of faith is always, always there. And so people actually feel disconnected when they have to leave a church because of homophobic rhetoric, or some of them stay within the church to try to see if they can change things from within or have conversations with people. And I know Reverend Norwood could probably, he could probably talk, for the rest of the session about the experiences that he's had. But I've seen that in my clinical practice and with my friends, with my community, and just in my daily living existence. So it definitely plays a huge, huge part.
Thank you so much for that. I think you make really great points regarding, there tending to be a negative spin once it comes to the Black community. And so that's what gets put forward. However, I really am glad to hear you talk about just the examples of acceptance that you've experienced amongst your patients. So talking about acceptance, do you think it's been enough, Dr. Mailbranch? Can it be more? Do you think the faith community, and that's all faiths, right? Whether it's Christianity, it doesn't matter what the faith. Do you think that they're as accepting of people in the LGBTQ community as you would like to see? If not, give some examples of how you think they could be a better models of that agape love that I think Dr. Norwood talked about.
Yeah, I think it is just kind of one of those things. One of the things I remember growing up was exactly what Reverend Norwood said was, love your neighbor as yourself, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's always been kind of a guiding principle of mine, just in how I navigate. And so I think when you ask if there are areas of improvement that certain faith communities can make, of course, there's always areas of improvement. Just as if you asked me if there are areas of improvement that the medical community could do to help our people cope with medical illnesses, wellness, sexual health and wellness, those kind of things. Yes, there's a lot of stuff we need to do. We are doing some good things. I think a lot of faith communities do amazing work. I've been working with faith communities for the entirety of my career. I remember Pernessa Seal used to have an organization called the Balm in Gilead back 20 years ago. And I met her in New York City. And I was I remember, I'll tell a quick story and then I'll be quiet for a second. But I went in to see her because I wanted to do a research project. And I was young. I was kind of in my late 20s. And I was like, Pernessa, I want to talk about, what people think in some of our churches, because I was practicing in Manhattan and in Harlem. What are we thinking about homosexuality and gay people in Black communities? What's going on? And I remember she sat back and she looked at me and she said, honey, we're not even ready to talk about sex on a general level. So you have to take baby steps with our churches before you bring us all over here. And I remember her telling that, and I thought to myself, she's so right. And so we have to kind of open up a lot of these conversations. And if I were to say one area of improvement that umbrellas the LGBTQ stuff, is that we have to actually talk about sex in more of a healthy way, in more of an honest way, in a transparent way, regardless of what your sexual orientation is, what your gender or gender identity is, who you're attracted to, what behaviors you engage in, and what you like to do. We have to talk about sex in a positive and affirming way instead of it just being, don't get nobody pregnant, don't get an STI, don't get HIV. Those conversations always start with pathology or a quote unquote negative result, rather than talking about how sex is something to be enjoyed. Sex is something that is pleasurable. Sex is something that connects us and allows us to express love to one another. So I think if we were to step back a little bit and start to approach things like that, we can kind of umbrella everything underneath. And then you can see people who may be attracted to the opposite gender will realize that the way they love someone of the opposite gender is the same way people express love to same gender loving people. It's just that you have a different gender when you go home to whoever you love at the end of the day.
Awesome. Thank you. Same question for you, Pastor Norwood. I'll ask it again. Do you think that the faith community has been as accepting as you would like to see? And if not, tell me how you think they could be. What are things tangible? Because I think what's one of the things we want to get accomplished here through these conversations is giving people something that they can leave with, right? Tangibly something that they can practice when at the end of the day, and not leave the same as they came when they tuned in to this broadcast. So tell us, Pastor Norwood.
I would say we're not there yet. We're making progress. We're making strides. There are always exceptions to these broad generalizations that, there's just a blanket rejection in the faith community. And I appreciated a lot of things that Dr. Mailbranch shared. I think that, as he stated, and I would agree with, that we have a hard time in faith communities just talking about sex in general. It seems to be taboo for a lot of reasons because of the reality, I think, that many people know is happening, but we just don't want to talk about it. And so I think that's a starting point to have honest conversations, to have settings and forums where people can really be honest about what's going on. Because one of the things I can pretty much tell you is we're having sex and all kinds of sex, but we're not necessarily talking about it or willing to talk about it. I came across a quote that, could be an impetus for honest dialogue in faith communities. It said that we do unto others what we would never want done to us. Mm. We do unto others what we would never want done unto us. And so when you think about other areas of discrimination, sometimes it gets much more traction, much more support, because it seems so broad. And yet with something that's taboo that you don't want to talk about, it's hard to even get the ball rolling, so to speak, because you won't even have honest conversations about the reality of what's going on. And sometimes it's like that cliche of the elephant in the room. We know it's going on, but we're just not talking about it. We know it's going on in the pulpit, in the choir stand, in the congregation. And sometimes I believe that what you will not confront, you will not overcome. And I think, in another way of looking at it, these honest conversations could help, because if you don't unload, you will explode. And so oftentimes people are there in the faith communities burning out, carrying a burden that they're not able to have lifted or addressed because of the taboo of even being honest. And so often in faith communities, we talk about things like being vulnerable. We talk about things like being transparent and authentic. And yet there's a breakdown when it comes to this subject. So I think you need safe spaces. And sometimes that starts in the pew with the laity. Sometimes it's from the pulpit with the pastoral leadership. Sometimes there's a combination. And some of what are sometimes described as more liberal progressive denominations. I served in the United Church of Christ, which is very open and affirming in many ways. You will find these conversations are more easily had, but I think that there's an issue across the board, particularly in faith communities of color, where we still have this challenge. Absolutely.
Both of you have kind of answered some of the other questions I had, but to Pastor Norwood, and then we're also going to bounce it over to you, Dr. Mailbranch. Thank you both for those responses so far. What do you think are the top reasons why, and the for real reasons, right? I think we could sometimes maybe even guess at the more surface or obvious reasons. But what do you think are the real reasons, top reasons for why many faith establishments have not stood up publicly and spoken loudly against the devastating impact that HIV/AIDS has had on our communities of Black and brown people, especially amongst our Black gay men and women? What are those top reasons you think, Dr.? Keep it real.
Am I starting or?
Yeah, you start.
Okay, sure. I think that because to have an honest conversation means that sometimes it includes revelation and illumination that we don't think we're ready to have. If
break it down. What does that mean?
So whenever there's an issue that leadership in a faith community has that they themselves have not confronted or admitted to, then they're not ready to confront it or admit it or have a public or an open, honest conversation about it. In other words, if that leadership is not out or that leadership does not acknowledge what I said earlier, that in all of our circle of friends, all of our families, all of our congregations, all of our student bodies, and I'm intentionally using the word all because I do think it's without exception, then we're not ready to be as transparent and authentic as we think that we are ready to be. And I think sometimes we so compartmentalize mental health and we so compartmentalize sexuality that we don't understand. We miss the connection points. We think that people come and that we're ministering to their souls and their spirits, and understand that it's kind of impossible not to minister to someone holistically, because when they come to worship, they bring all that they are and all that they are not. And so it's up to us to understand that, embrace that, and accept that. And so the same way I make that statement to pastors that I teach, I minister from that point of view. That when I minister, I know that everyone is there, whether they feel comfortable being public and authentic with who they are or not. And so the word that goes forth needs to be a word of hope, a word of affirmation, a word of strength, a word of uplift that can benefit everyone, because sometimes people are just struggling to make it through the service, to make it through the day, to make it another week. And sometimes what you say is the make or break. And so I think it's critical that we do better than we have been doing.
I agree. Yeah. That's fantastic. So I heard you say, sounds like many in the faith community, and I think that you made a great point that it starts at the top. It starts with the leadership, and that if the leadership doesn't check themselves, right, I have to do a real self-check, then there's going to be some issues trying to really be authentic about your messaging to your congregation. Dr. David, what do you think?
No, I agree with Pastor Norwood about the compartmentalization of this. Like we tend to put people in boxes as if we don't have different kind of identities that bring us into a whole individual. I would add to that I think people aren't going to be ready to talk about things in public in general terms if they haven't reconciled that within themselves. And human beings are very complicated, right? And sexuality is very fluid. There are people that are attracted to both genders. There are people that are attracted to diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. But because of the word, and I'll use the word stigma that's out there around sex and the stigma that's around HIV, it's automatically equated that if someone expresses an interest in sexual health or HIV or LGBTQ health, someone's going to look at them side eyes and be like, are they trying to come out? Like, what's going on? Who they sleeping with at the end of the day? And that kind of gossip mill happens. So someone has to be very firm in their internal convictions to say, hey, I'm at peace with who I am myself. And it doesn't matter what you think of me. I know this is important for our communities, for our congregations, and I'm going to push it forward. So I think that's one of the barriers. And then kind of continuing along that line with stigma, we have to remember that churches are businesses. And I have seen people who have either, pastors who have either invited people in and said, okay, I am same gender loving, or I am gay, or I am bisexual, lose congregations, lose thousands of people, hundreds of people at some times. And I've seen it also happen, not on that individual level, but if they start really speaking up about HIV, about other things like that, people who may hold more kind of fundamentalist approaches or interpretations of the Bible may say, you know what, I'm not down with that. That's too progressive for me. And then they check out. And so you're not only looking at an individual level where you can be stigmatized, but it stigmatizes a church, a congregation, which ends up influencing a bottom line in someone's business and someone's livelihood. And so people make those kind of decisions all the time. Can I do this? And is it worth to me as an individual risking losing all this stuff I've built up if everyone turns against me? And that's a hard thing to do. A lot of us that are sitting on the outside would be like, well, have some integrity and just do it. It's important, but it's easier said than done when you're not kind of in it. So I think those are two important dynamics that I think are barriers to why more people don't get involved or more passionate about this topic.
Awesome points on from both of you. Awesome points. I don't even think that, people kind of think about that aspect in terms of how making a stance on any issue, right? It might be any issue can impact the business of the church and the livelihood technically of the church. But I'm sure Pastor Norwood would maybe quote that scripture, you got to count the costs, right? What's the cost? I'd like to hear your response to that too, Pastor Norwood.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the words I would focus on is stigma. That sometimes stigma sometimes is too high a cost. Gossip, just people misunderstanding why you're raising it, talking about the issue. People's antennas go up, and I'm sad to say that the cliche or sometimes stereotype of gossip in faith communities can sometimes have reality to it. And so I think for me, with Jesus as the model in terms of his ministry, a while back, some time ago, there was a cliche in Protestant religious communities. It was a WWJD, which stood for What Would Jesus Do? And I argue you don't have to ask what would Jesus do in some situations. You can look at what he did. And his whole ministry was about approaching marginalized people, everybody that society rejected.
Absolutely.
And so if you follow his model, you realize that if he would have allowed stigma to be the determining factor as to whether he reached out and elevated, engaged all of these marginalized groups and populations, that ministry, that life-changing revolutionary ministry would have never happened. And so for me, I do not allow the stigma or the threat of what somebody may think to allow me from reaching out to touch, to love, to embrace, to listen, because I feel compelled, as I said earlier, by my faith and the model I see in Jesus Christ, if I'm going to follow that truth, that I cannot distinguish or discriminate. And so that's just the point at which I've arrived. And I think, again, going back to earlier comments we made, I think when people of faith don't see it that way, it's because they have compartmentalized and made conscious and unconscious choices through conscious and unconscious bias. And sometimes they need to be called on it. And sometimes, to use the language of faith, they need to be convicted by the Holy Spirit. And sometimes the way in which that happens is through a personal connection.
Absolutely.
In theology, we call this embedded theology versus deliberative theology. You've been taught one way about sexuality and what's prohibited, what's unacceptable. But when it comes to your doorstep, when it's your child, when it's a member of your family, you kind of step back and you've got to rethink this. And as a pastor, I've been called into those situations to help families process this. And so, Nicole, you mentioned the words. You mentioned the word agape. What a powerful word. It's a Greek word, one of at least 6 different Greek words, but that one means unconditional love. And so I help people process and practice that, basically.
Awesome. So next question. Excellent conversation. So, okay, we've been talking about what the faith community.
Oops. I think Nicole may have frozen and bounced out, unfortunately.
Hopefully she will be back.
Reverend Nora, did you see the question over here? I saw a question in the comments. It said, Pastor Norwood, have you faced any barriers to being a voice for the voiceless as it relates to HIV/AIDS in the faith community? And if so, how have you dealt with it? I think it's a great question.
Thank you for sharing it, because I did not see that. And I think as well, that's a great question. And I would say I've faced some resistance. I don't know about obstacle. Maybe that's too strong a word, but I find that this is a taboo subject among people in general, people of faith in particular, and clergy leaders in particular. Sometimes it's just something else for some faith leaders who do not want to add that to an already long list of things that they're going to address and confront in some ways. And so I wouldn't say so much obstacles as resistance. And for me, the reason I would choose the word resistance as opposed to obstacles is that when you meet resistance, you can choose to go on or not. Mm-hmm. I just seek to connect and partner with pastors and individuals who have the same ethic, the same perspective, who refuse to distinguish and, discriminate against persons because of stigma. And so you could maybe argue, that's an obstacle, semantics here. But for me, resistance, because you never know what someone's experience is, what their perceptions are, and the image that they're trying to hold up. And for me, I've gone past those things. And for me, again, what urges me and compels me is this ethic I see in Jesus Christ. Yeah. So thank you for that.
No, and I like the approach, because I do that a lot in medicine too. And again, I think there are a lot of parallels, and a lot of times I will tell people that, kind of about how I function as a medical provider is I call it my ministry or my calling, because it is a kind of form of healing that coincides or intersects with the faith community and with faith healers. And I think we can all do those things on different levels, but I love how you put it into a context of it's about affirmation. It's about positivity. I don't try to look at things as always about barriers or deficits. And we talk about those things way too much. And I'd rather talk about kind of what works. As much as someone would want to always say, well, okay, give me an example. Or there was this example where someone discriminated against this young Black gay child or this young Black trans woman. I would also say, well, okay, let's talk about that. But let's also talk about the examples where people have been embraced and affirmed and loved no matter what, and people are accepting everyone. And let's build on that a little bit more. I would rather talk about those things and then try to put that in a bottle and get that on a larger level to say, well, what works for us? What makes us feel whole? What affirms us? What brings us to a higher plane? Or like you said, what brings us closer to Jesus? What do we do in those cases? And how can we spread that love around using one example rather than saying, well, something bad happened or a negative outcome happened. And then how do we backtrack and react to it? I'd rather start. It's kind of like looking at wellness and health as opposed to starting with disease and working backwards.
Yeah, that's a good segue to. I now see the questions in the chat, and I see a question that asks, how do we get faith institutions to go beyond just the AIDS ministry and testing and really do the critical work that's needed in faith institutions to shift the trajectory of what's happening in our community? Well, That's a great question. I think we have to start somewhere, and we have to lift up models and examples that other churches can follow. We have to give them options. I think at our congregation that one of the things that's helped is that we happen to have a nurse who's retired from HIV and AIDS care from Grady Hospital who leads our local ministry. And we are thankful and grateful for her because of her sensitivity. And so she becomes a tipping point. She becomes one around which we can build a coalition and partner with other churches, individuals. And that begins to change the dialogue to where you certainly begin perhaps with information, you begin with testing, and I guess the critical work can be described a number of different ways, but you try to connect people to linkage to care that we talked about earlier. You try to provide affirmation where you're providing support, sometimes at home, sometimes for basic needs. And I think it starts and it grows, but I think it's always helpful to be aware of individuals and examples and models that you can connect with, that you can emulate, and find parts that you know, maybe you can't do the whole model, but you can find something that you can do. Everybody can do something. I love to make this statement. God didn't give everybody, he didn't give anybody everything, but he gave everybody something. And so we have to use what we have.
Awesome.
Nicole is back too. Nicole, can I ask a question? I don't know whether you want to start with this. There was somebody, and I know you have to move on, so let me know. But
go ahead.
There was an older question that someone asked that said, how can we put the Black church at the front of the issues that surround Black and Brown communities? How do we create those safe spaces? And I think you've been answering a little bit. And I think Reverend Norwood talked a little bit about that, creating those safe spaces. I would just put in, like, I think sometimes when people see an initiative that's around HIV, they're worried about the stigma that's going to be associated if they show up or if they support. And I do think there's a way you can talk about health and wellness and bring it on a general level. And while we're talking about, say, you know, women get your mammograms, everybody do colonoscopies or watch your blood pressure, your diabetes, include sexual health, and as Reverend Norwood mentioned, mental health as a part of that. So people don't see them as separate compartments, like, oh, it's HIV over here, and that's separate and distinct from everything else. This all folds into like our health and wellness. So I think if we create initiatives, whether it be, you know, a function on a weekend where we get health professionals, or it's the focus of a sermon on a Sunday, or someone takes on a Bible study and takes a passage in the Bible and ties it into those kind of things. I think as long as that gets normalized and integrated into the general fabric of whatever our faith communities or our congregations are doing on a daily basis, then it normalizes that conversation, and it doesn't make it so spread out that someone is like, well, okay, now we're going to talk about sex. Now we're going to talk about HIV. It becomes something that people realize, like, oh, this is something we should all talk about. So I think that's one thing that I would put out there, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys think as well.
100% agree with that. I think normalizing it is key. I think it is still seen separately. Like even when I go to the doctor, right, for my annual physicals, they still make you sign this separate piece of paper. I'm like, for what? Just run all the tests, run everything that you're supposed to, that you think I could be doing, so that, you know, it's not like this extra separate thing. So I 100% agree with you. And I think we have to continue to have a conversation. We have to be willing, you know, to have those honest conversations, because like you both said all along the session today, is sex is happening. People are real. It's happening. That's how you got here. You know, so let's just be for real. We need to have conversations in a healthy way, in a way that makes it normal, and then how we see healthcare and how we address it. It's a part of our well-being, our total well-being. What do you think, Pastor?
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to share something that I sometimes share with pastors, and I want to preface the comment that I share with them by reminding you that I teach in a very conservative environment with pastors who are often totally resistant to anything I'm saying, even hostile when I make the statement that the LGBTQ plus community are a part of your circle of friends. Like, you don't know my friends. Your family, you don't know my family. Your congregation, you don't know my congregation. So this is, I start sometimes at this place, and this may be a rudimentary, elementary place from some people's perspective, but it's actually a statement that was attributed to Dave Chappelle, of all people. And he wrote, our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle or orientation, you must fear or hate them.
Hmm.
The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe, say, or do. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. And so
Wow.
sometimes when I get people to start at the link of being compassionate, growth and understanding happens. And I see the same people who are open to this statement, open to compassion. A year from then, they've grown because they become, these are people like me. They begin to see for themselves. And so again, this may seem like a rudimentary, elementary statement, but it's a starting point that I use to help people to open these conversations and dialogue and get people to grow, to move down the road of what I believe is, again, what urges and informs and compels me in my faith and my approach.
Absolutely. Were there other comments that you all wanted to respond to that were in the chat? I've kind of lost some of them because of when I got blacked out.
I see one here that says, if we are to destigmatize AIDS or HIV in the LGBTQ community, what responsibility do cisgendered clergy have to embrace clergy who identify as a part of LGBTQ communities?
Ah.
I'll leave that for the good Reverend Doctor.
Yes, sir.
That's a challenge.
It's a challenge.
Yeah, I just want to admit that right off the bat. It's a challenge. I think it happens one person at a time, one relationship at a time. And, you know, again, part of that comment that I make that offends so many pastors about the LGBTQ plus community and your circle of friends, family, congregation, our student body, is that includes the clergy. And so sometimes that's a starting point. Sometimes it's not. It's just about being real open and honest, because there will be different perspectives and disagreements on a number of things, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't communicate. You shouldn't dialogue for the sake of what is best for all. And so I think that we leave out a critical part of our ministry of what God has called us to do when we shut doors and we close ourselves off. And so I've just been able through the years of my own experience to grow beyond that and to realize, in essence, we need each other. We support each other. We help to fill in blind spots. Some of us have bald spots, but all of us have blind spots. so I think it's helpful that we see the benefit of it, the advantage of it, in terms of what it brings to us when we open ourselves to that.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, we have not too many questions left, honestly. So, and you both have been saying this honestly throughout the entire conversation. That's how good y'all are. But I'll ask it again in terms of tangible things, tangible advice. So if you could speak to the pastors directly, look straight into your camera, pastors, clergy, lay people in churches, mosques, etc., about this particular topic, what tangible advice would you offer to them so that they can be a part of the solution to reduce the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS in the community, especially amongst communities of color? This particular platform, of course, addresses people of color who are disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS. And let's just pick another health topic. We're also disproportionately impacted by those as well. Diabetes, heart disease, right? Dr. David, just pick a issue. We're number one in terms of disparate outcomes. So give me 3 tangible things that pastors, clergy, lay people in churches. I love Nader Stewart. I know she's watching. Hi, Miss Nader. She works at Bible Way Ministry. She's a nurse. She leads their HIV/AIDS ministry, works with Pastor Norwood. And, lots of times it's the lay people, right, that kind of reach the community and are out there saying the stuff that maybe they should not be saying, or saying the things that they need to be saying. So let's don't forget them as well. Three things, tangible advice to reduce stigma. Anybody start.
Well, I would tell you that I would say to you that I love Nader Stewart as well. She's one of my favorite people on the planet. She's what we call at our church an intercessor. So she's a woman of prayer, she's a woman of faith, and she's a woman of praxis. So she is the retired nurse in the area of HIV and AIDS from Grady Hospital, although she's still in private practice, and she gives so much of herself and her time to us. So we could not do what we do without extraordinary volunteers and leaders, servant leaders like Nader, and the persons who work with her as a part of her team. So shout out to her. But if I were to list three things that can be done, is to commit yourself to establish a relationship with someone who has a different perspective, a different philosophy, a different orientation than you do. Make a commitment to establish a relationship. Begin with simple talk, conversation, dialogue, meet for coffee. I think it's only when we try to sit where someone else sits that we begin to hear and feel and understand things that we've not felt, heard, and understood before. We've got to let our guard down. We've got to be willing to take that step, build a relationship. A second thing for me to do that I would suggest that people do is to inform yourself. Sometimes we think we know everything and we know very little. We know just enough to get ourselves in trouble. So I would suggest that we find safe places and spaces to really inform ourselves about this topic, about this issue. You gave some stats, Nicole, at the beginning, which are alarming, which are convicting. And I think that when we understand the compounded weight of other medical conditions, of racism, of all the other stigmas on top of this, it ought to give us the kind of compassion that says, if we can provide any sort of relief and support, is that not what we are called to do? Is that not, for me, the core message of the gospel, the good news? And so I think, again, it would be to inform yourself. And then a third thing would be for us to ask ourselves, what can I do? After we learn, after we read, after we inform ourselves, what can I do? And I think all of us, going back to a statement I made a while ago, God did not give anybody everything, but he gave everybody something. And so when we think about what God has given us, we have access to resources and people. We have what I call relationship capital, where we can connect with people, sometimes specifically that other people don't have the privilege to connect to, sometimes people of influence, people in our congregations, so that we begin by taking inventory of what we have in terms of what we can do, and we make a decision that we're going to do it, no matter how small it seems, no matter how large it seems. I'm going to, make a habit of regularly informing myself. I'm going to connect with persons who are from another marginalized community that I have ignored, and perhaps in my ignorance of it, I have compounded their suffering. So for me, those are the three things I would suggest.
And Dr. David?
I'll be brief because I know we're running out of time. I would say start by listening to people around you in your congregation, in your choir, about these issues around diversity. I would say also don't operate out of a place of fear. Reverend Norwood mentioned fear before, and I think if we're operating more out of love instead of fear, you'll get a little bit further with things. So that's something concrete you can apply to everything. Then also speak up. As I mentioned earlier, talking about sex in a normalized manner, whether it be a sermon, whether it be a Bible study, whether it be a health and wellness fair, just incorporate it in some way, shape, or form. I think those are tangible things you can do. But the other two are kind of, it revolves a mindset change, a change in your paradigm and how you approach things. And you can apply it to a bunch of different tangible things that you do within your faith community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Alrighty. So before we ask the final words of wisdom, we're going to do our third raffle. Thank you, all of you on Facebook who are still in with us and are chiming in and asking questions and being engaged. So our third question to the audience, first 7 who respond correctly will go into our raffle. Tell us how many people in the United States are living with HIV. And I can tell you that it's too many.
Mm.
Also up on our screen is our Black Leadership AIDS Crisis Coalition, and the website for that is www.blacc.net. Check out the website, learn more about what BLACC is doing. Okay, so as people enter their information, our final question is just simple. What final words of wisdom or takeaways would you like to give to the audience before we close out our session today? Go ahead, Dr. Mailbranch.
Okay. I think the one thing I would say, and it brings me back to a story. There's a phrase that people use a lot of times that I've heard in faith communities, which is "hate the sin, not the sinner." That gets thrown out a lot. Or "I love so and so, I just don't agree with their lifestyle." So I typically flip that on its end. And since I'm a same gender loving man, a lot of times I'll say, well, you know, straight people, some of the best people in the world are straight people. I don't agree with their lifestyle necessarily. And I say it as a joke. A friend of mine who was traumatized, he was also gay, traumatized as a kid within a lot of churches, a lot of Black communities he navigated within. I remember I hired him as a research assistant and an interviewer. And this is a man of faith. And we were interviewing Black men in general of any sexuality, just about their experiences growing up with race, racism, so on and so forth. And he was so reluctant to interview these heterosexual brothers because he had been traumatized as a kid. And he thanked me at one point after he did a whole bunch of interviews. He said, "David, you know, I sat down and as we talked, I realized that we had so much in common." He grew up in Detroit. He had certain experiences with a lot of the brothers he was interviewing. And he said, "You know, the only thing is at the end of the day, who we're attracted to and who we love is the different. Our experiences as Black men were very, very similar." So what I would say to people is that the most insidious trick that white supremacy has done on us and convincing us with anti-Blackness is that the diversity within our Black communities, that it should split us up. It should fragment us. It should fracture us. And what I would encourage everyone to do is, particularly when we're talking about diversity within our communities, don't let other people convince you that other people of African descent from the diaspora are wrong because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or they have a certain perspective or a quote unquote lifestyle that doesn't quite gel with yours. Remember that we're all one community. We have different kinds of communities and interests and beliefs, but that doesn't have to split us apart, because that's pretty much what people want to do, is divide and conquer us, and we can't let that happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pastor Norwood, you have the final say.
I'll be short. I would say faith over fear, love over hate, compassion over everything.
Amen.
Say that again. Say those three again so we can put them on screen, Tim.
Faith over fear, love over hate, compassion over everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, if I look back at this conversation, we've been basically unpacking those things from that loaded word that you used, Nicole, of agape, to what both Dr. has shared and myself. Again, faith over fear, love over hate, compassion over everything. I think that begins to transform who we are as communities of faith, who we are as human beings. So
awesome. All righty. So I just again wanted to thank these esteemed panelists. I knew they would be the exact right two panelists for this first inaugural session of Conversations in Black. And I thank you both so much for taking this time of your Sunday to be with us and to talk with the community out there. We hope that people got as much out of it as I surely did. I knew you would both be fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. And please stay on, okay? We have our final raffle, people. Okay. And it's going to go to the top 7 audience members. So you have no control over it. You can't put anything else in. Don't try to type in 5 times. We'll go to the top 7 audience members who have posted at least 5 times in the chat. Don't start posting now. Too late. All righty. And we are going to move to our raffle winners. We've come to that time. Also, please, if you when you are announced the winner, we will need you to go to the BLACC Facebook inbox messaging and put your email account, your email address, in there so that we can email you your e-gift card. So once we announce the winner, please go to the Facebook, BLACC Facebook inbox messaging and put your email in there. Thank you, everyone. All righty, are we ready? Jason? And thanks again to everybody who tuned in today. Ooh, Melvin Wright. Which question was that one? I think that was the second question. HIV Awareness Day. Good job. All righty, Melvin Wright, please put your email address in the Facebook chat. Next question. How many people living with HIV in the US? Who was the winner? We got 2 winners?
No, you see the...
Is that Stephanie Williams? Yay! Stephanie Williams won our second raffle. Good job, Stephanie. We're going to lunch, Stephanie. Thank you. And then our third raffle. Person who engaged the most. Imara Kennedy. Imara, sorry, you can't win. Wah, wah. But you're still a winner to me, Mara. We're going to save that for a patient somewhere. One of Dr. David's patients.
We're spinning again.
Okay, let's see. It can't be any of these people. No. Teresa can't win either. Okay, look what we're just going to do this, Jason. We're going to give it to Melvin White. Melvin White, please put your name in the Melvin White, put your name in the Facebook inbox. And if it's the same Melvin, he looks like he's getting 2 gift cards today for being engaged. Good job, Melvin. All right, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you again to our fantastic panelists, Dr. Monty Norwood, Dr. David Mailbranch. We appreciate you. Have a great day, everybody.